Oh. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live episode of In Lay Terms. I am not centered. I just realized that. I'm here with my friend, Jim McMurtry. Welcome back, Jim.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, Payman.
Did I pronounce your name right, or is it the Mr. Residential School Denier?
I don't know how to define myself these days, but if I can live with it. That's how I'm being labeled by current legislation or proposed legislation.
Jim, we got so much to go over, and it's kind of interesting. I didn't plan it this way, but apparently yesterday was Truth and Reconciliation Day. Am I correct?
It sure was. And I went to Tim Hortons with an orange shirt that said, "Where are the missing bodies?" And I posted it, and currently it has almost 1 million views. So I wasn't trying to upset anybody, but I really think that there needs to be an opposing view to what's happening in our government, where they're trying to criminalize, even put in jail for up to 2 years, people who do anything to diminish or downplay in any way what is obviously a false narrative.
Well, why don't we start there? I thought we were going to ease our way into that, but what is going on? What's going on that's causing all this tension in Canada?
Well, I ask an excellent question, and I don't think the tension's good. I feel, just from my perspective as a teacher, that there was a movement that when I was in university they called deconstructionism. It's very similar to decolonialism, but deconstruction was part of, as I since have learned, something even broader, coming from France, from philosophers there like Foucault, and it means it's so postmodernism, the idea that everything about our society can be improved. So that's all very positive. But it came to the point where everything needs to be reformed, and I think that the approach that schools took was there needed to be a good guy and a bad guy. So the bad guy is Western civilization or all our institutions, and maybe specifically the white race and also males. Anyhow, all these different groups that have been seen as at fault for the flaws in society. So I think what they've done, look at the George Floyd moment, that they blame police and racism and so forth. And it wasn't the actions of so much of George Floyd or the police officer who arrested him, as much as it was a systemic problem of white racism against Black people. That's how I see it. In Canada, we have racism against lots of people, long ago with the Chinese laborers working on the railway, and Komaganaru and the St. Louis with the Jews. Anyhow, just all the different stories of Canada not treating minorities well and so forth. And I think Trudeau seized on something, Payman. I think he seized on a mood where people wanted to, and this is a religious impulse, they wanted to repent. They wanted to have something to feel bad about. And the intentions were good, again, to make Canada a better place. But I think it's had the opposite effect, because to do that, as in the George Floyd moment, they ended up pretending that all police forces were racist and needed to be defunded. And in Canada, what we're doing is we're presenting Christian churches that worked, I think, honorably for the most part, with Indigenous people through treaties and so forth to provide residential schools as supported by the government. I think we're vilifying them as a way to a virtue signal, as a way to feel better about ourselves, to atone for a past that we to cleanse ourselves. Maybe that's it. Just this idea of the original sin is the same. It wasn't enough to be born without sin. We needed to, for some reason, it's better to have sin, to have darkness, and then achieve lightness and goodness and truth and beauty and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's what it is. I think it was certainly well-intentioned. I think people want to do the right thing for Indigenous people. But it took a really wrong turn in 2021, and that's when I was walked out of my school and career. when they started to lie about all sorts of things. And one of the things was that there were 215 child bodies in Kamloops when there weren't. Nothing was discovered there. But also that there were missing and children in unmarked graves all over Canada. And so one of the writers and the commissioner of the chief commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Marie Sinclair, argued that could be as many as 25,000 or more missing children. And of course, if they're missing, that means their end was nefarious. And so I think it's, I think it's really unfortunate, and that's where we are right now. We're busy on and trying to stain Canadian society, and certainly past Canadians.
So I want to get to the residential schools and reconciliation, but my question was actually broader. And you and I kind of talked about this, but when I say what's up with the tension, I think this is my opinion. I think Trudeau thought he could come in and he could, blame straight white men, and somehow he gets the Middle Eastern vote or the multiculturalism vote. But then someone like you gets 1 million views. That tells me that there's a lot of pissed off people out there that are saying, hey, we're good people. Just, you can't blame us for the color of our skin. Oh, am I right or wrong?
That fits in exactly what I'm saying. It's not just Indigenous people. It's all sorts of minority groups. It's telling women that men are bad. It's telling non-Christians that Christians are bad. It's telling wealthy people, poor people, that wealthy people are bad. Like the talk, maybe this goes back, the 1%, maybe that goes back 10, 15 years anyhow. But there always is going to be a boogeyman. There's always going to be the equivalent of Emmanuel Goldstein in Orwell's 1984. There's a force of evil in the world, and we need to fight it. What I don't understand is how we could take a society that welcomes people for example, from Iran, and treats them, I think, to a much better way of life, where there really is human dignity and rights and freedoms and so forth. Why we need to stain ourselves. I think we should see ourselves as a beacon for all others, but we don't do that. We're I think, very much of the opinion that the answer is to demean ourselves. The answer is to, it used to be to make yourself feel better, you put down other people. Now it's to make ourselves feel better, we're putting down ourselves.
Yeah, it's almost suicidal, and I don't know where this comes from, because this never happens in Iran. It's the opposite in Iran. People are proud of their culture.
And they have good reason to be proud of their culture. And I say that because it's a culture that's produced an incredible amount of spectacular art and writing, and I think wisdom. Yeah. Anyhow, obviously, if you go back into that part of the world, we owe much of our math and science and so forth to early Persians. So the Iranians have a lot to be proud of. Coming to Canada, the hope is that they feel that they have the same rights and opportunities and dreams they're entitled to anyway as anybody else. And that's what our charter has done. It just makes it, all of us, whatever we look like on the outside, fundamentally equal. And I don't know why we want to go away from that. And where I live in British Columbia, there's people are saying, oh, it's unceded land, which isn't true. And because it's unceded land, we should start giving it back to the previous owners. It's not really sure who the previous owners were, because it's not something that was very, very carefully documented. But what we have here is a situation where the NDP government said, oh, all of the Queen Charlotte Islands, which some people refer to as Haida Gwaii, belongs now to a race of people. And those of a different race, if they come live there, which is, again, still part of Canada, they're to be second-class citizens. They're to be the vassals to the new feudal landowners. And I think my situation as a teacher is important in itself. The idea that we'd walk a teacher out of a classroom, out of a job, for saying the wrong thing. I don't understand. I think people have the right to their own opinion, and also have people the right to get things wrong. And in my particular case, can get things wrong. But I think what I am fighting for is the same thing that you're fighting for, Payman, and have done an incredible job in recent times, because I followed you. And that is to get people to be more critical of those who are, I think, pathologically critical and derogatory toward not only Canada as a state, but toward my ancestors. I had 4 ancestors who were missionaries, and not so long ago. I'm sure there are more than that. But to have a great grandfather and a great great grandfather and 2 great uncles, and to present them as well, in the case of Kamloops, is similar, that all missionaries were people who wanted to abuse, torture, and murder Indigenous kids, when what they were doing in truth was what all teachers do, and supervisors of children away from their homes, which is to try and reproduce the best values the values that they themselves grew up with and adhere to. And if they're Christian, I don't think people should be embarrassed by that. And obviously over time they became secular, but I don't think at any time that the priests and the nuns had any intention to do harm, and to, if we were to bring back somebody who worked in a residential school, or someone who doing anything 100 years, 150 years ago, and said to them, oh, you were homophobic, or you didn't use pronouns, or you were racist, or you were chauvinistic, or whatever, I think they would give us a pretty strong tongue lashing and just say, look, I came with nothing. I worked hard to build up a life for myself and my family and community, and I have reason to be proud of myself.
Why don't we start at the beginning, and then we can end with your ancestors? It's my understanding that when the British came, putting aside the French, the British came, they got into conflict with.
Okay. Can I stop for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just gonna move rooms. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Or
go for it.
Would that mess it up?
As long as you got internet connection, it should work.
Oh no, but do you want? Is it going to be a problem if it's a different background?
I'm fine with this. You can go ahead and change the room if you like.
Why are you moving? Oh, I'm making here a bit of noise. I don't want to distract you. I just got my wife making dinner and stuff.
Okay, you can go in another room.
Are you hearing background noise?
I don't mind it, but I can hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let me. It's easier for me. So I'm going to go into a different room and set up. Okay. Is that okay? Yep. Or am I messing things up for?
No. Go ahead. Take your time.
This is tape, right? So you can cut it out.
No, this is live, but it's fine.
No, we don't want to do that then. Let's stay where we are, and my wife's gonna be finished soon. So
it's fine. It's not that bad. So my question was, if we go back to like the conquest of the native Indians by the British, I'm assuming part of it was conquest. So it was a war, and they took the land, and part of it was through treaty. Now, if it's in the treaty, and the British said we give this land belongs to the ancestral homeland or whatever tribe, I can understand that. But what's happening with Haida Gwaii, that's not treaty, right? That's just the NDP, or what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, it's the most abominable treatment of ordinary Canadians who have the right to property, who have the right to fair treatment under the law with taxation, and so there's so much that's going wrong. But most, with the exception of the Peace River area, which is the tiny part of there's a small prairie area in northeastern British Columbia. Aside from that area, there weren't formal treaties signed. But when British Columbia became first a province in 1858, and then a colony, united colony in 1858, and then a province in 71 and 1871. There was just everybody there was part of the land, was crown land. The land was was owned by the, first, of course, the Hudson Bay Company, and but by the federal government once it became 1867, and before that by the British government. And so the notion that different people, nomadic bands, because many of them, even near Vancouver, were nomadic. They didn't live in the same place year round. I wrote a book on the Kwantlen First Nation, and they didn't live in one spot year round. So this idea of, and then of course there's constant warfare. So there was always one group taking over from another group. There was extermination, and there was colonialism. It was all the things that visited all societies around the world. I don't believe that Indigenous society was in any way, I'm not saying in any way better or worse. I'm just simply saying that that they were not the governing people when Canada was formalized as a country, and they have no right outside of the land that is being given to them. They have no right to additional land. And but I think the tendency of modern people right now is to say, well, no, we look a lot better, particularly those of us who are the top institutions, if we can say we did all these things for this particular agreed group. But when you do that, it's a zero-sum game. You give special rights to one group, such as taxation or complete control over the lives of people in Haida Gwaii. Then what about those who can't vote because they don't have the right blood quantum of the Haida? I just think it's a new apartheid, and I think it's incredibly dangerous. And yet I get in trouble at school if I don't use the right pronouns for kids, or if I don't use the right term on all sorts of things, or if I use a word like retarded, which is a common word. I'm a French teacher, so retardé or whatever. And but anyhow, if you read Kill Mockingbird and you pronounce the N word, that teachers can lose their jobs for this. So there's just so much sensitivity to all these things, and it's made Canadians rather sheepish and afraid, and almost like a little kid cowering in a corner of a room. And then when big things come along, and this is a big thing, when people want to take away people's privacy rights, people's voting rights, and but people are trained now to be quiet and just sort of accept it. And I think I just never imagined what's happened. I could never, if someone had said to me, Payman, as just coming back to my narrow world as a classroom teacher, someone said to me that To Kill a Mockingbird was going to be banned from the Surrey School District and all over Canada, along with Dr. Seuss and Charles Dickens and Roald Dahl and on and on and on. I would have said, no, that won't happen, because great literature, has stood the test of time. And look at Shakespeare. It was written in the turn of the 16th century and late 1500s or 1600s. Hamlet 1608. No. It's gone through all sorts of dark times, and it has been thrown out. They're not going to get rid of Seuss, and they did. So I don't understand wokeism. I don't understand the new times, and I don't know if your viewers want to hear me wax poetic about all of life, all of a society, and maybe they think that I'm not a great authority. But where I am an authority is I'm an authority on what goes on in a school as a longtime teacher and principal and union activist and so forth. I'm also someone with an academic pedigree and whatever, and I've studied this. So if I'm talking about residential schools, in addition to, and particularly residential schools, we think all the different types of schools, I speak with authority. I have a PhD. I have many publications to my name. I know what I'm talking about. And yet, of course, people look at me as some sort of monster. I was called a monster in several responses to my post yesterday on X, and I had a number of threats, a great number of threats. So it's just a sort of I'm so glad that you've got background noise too. I don't feel so sheepish, so badly.
Yeah.
But I think I have something of value to say. And I only mentioned that I had that successful post yesterday, and I had another one of over 200,000 just yesterday. Because I think what I'm saying, and there are many people like me online, and you're one of them. You're somebody who is an independent social media voice and a powerful, intelligent one. Is I think together what we're doing is we're countering what a lot of people are being taught in an indoctrinative way, that no, this is it. Residential schools are houses of horror, and if you say anything other than that, we're gonna hit you over the head. And I think that's true about the trucker convoy. I think it's true about the overly stringent COVID regulations. I think it's true about all sorts of, the trans movement and how people just have to accept drag queens in kindergarten classes. I think people like you and me, Payman, are just people who are experienced cognitive dissonance and didn't understand. We're hearing one thing, but we're seeing another. And why is it? Why is it if there are children that were murdered in residential schools, and we're supposed to do all sorts of things such as adopt United Nations Declaration of Independence, Declaration of Indigenous Peoples Rights and so forth. If we're supposed to do those things, then it should be on the basis of there really being, the facts of really being as they have been presented. But if the facts are false, are doctored, then it just, to me, it just destroys where we go from here as a society. If I am, as a white older male, going to be presented as a racist for the rest of my life every time I open my mouth, then why would I want to buy into any reconciliation?
That's a good point. I mentioned this to you earlier. I think the left completely overplayed their hand from 2015 until today. They've just been running roughshod, and the people are fed up. And because I'm running as a candidate, it gives me one amazing opportunity to talk to people off the record, on phone, privately. And ordinary people are really pissed off. Like, they're pissed off at what's going on in the schools. That's a big one. But they're also pissed off with all of this racism nonsense, this land acquisition.
Yeah, and if I could add a couple of things, so I mentioned gender already, and encouraging kids to move into different sexual identities, and to the point of taking puberty blockers, and girls binding their chests, and boys being encouraged to wear makeup and heels. And that's awful. And then, as I said, they're falsifying history. They're censoring literature. They're lowering standards. They're even doing equity marking, where there's more chances and more opportunities and more rewards and more scholarships, and for kids based on skin color. My gosh, the world's your oyster right now if you're Indigenous in Canada, because, for example, going into medical or law school, many of these schools, it's not an equal standard. If you're a Chinese Canadian, good luck getting into medical school, because there's so many high level students and who are of Chinese origin in Canada. And so with quota programs through affirmative action, that we do a good job of making it almost impossible for them to get into an elite professional program. And for other groups, we make it almost impossible for them not to get in. And I think one day people are going to become really very cynical about this and angry. And I think this is when civil strife begins, when people feel that they're not being fairly treated about something that is completely irrelevant, and in the case of Canada, quite contrary to the laws of the land. In my case, just one last thing I want to say to you, and if I talk too much, just tell me, Jim, you're talking too much. But it is an important point for me. So right now, I haven't taught for a number of years, as said, and my regulatory body wants to take away my license for life. And they wanted to, starting 3 years ago, before ever hearing from me. And I think that's an interesting thing, that people with power over me can take away my professional license without hearing from me. You think of habeas corpus, you think of Magna Carta, you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, and then, of course, long before 1215, to the rights that people had, even at the lowest, segments of society, people had some rights. And I'm going, look at how I've been treated. How can people walk me out of a school and career, and to do that in front of my students? They could only do that if I was an immediate threat to those students. And yet the only thing that I said that caused any problem with anybody in the classroom was I said that the kids that died while in attendance at residential school did so mostly from disease, particularly tuberculosis. That's all I said. And of course, that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Report says, which was, again, authored by Indigenous people. So I think there's the Trudeau government, to me, and I'm not saying that I ran for the Liberals. I ran federally for the Liberals, and I think about 18 years ago. So it's not. I'm not somebody that's that has an animus against Liberals, but I don't understand how this party, that Trudeau's main accomplishment in office is through bills restricting people's rights and freedoms, because he thinks he's protecting harm toward this group or that group by restricting people's basic rights online and and television and print media. And anyhow,
We have a question from the audience if you want to answer it.
I'm so honored.
Let me see if I can find it. Are any elements of the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric taught at all any longer in elementary school? Is there any critical thinking with steel manning of both sides involved?
Yeah, well, these are elevated terms, and so the person who's asking this question is someone who's highly educated. I would like to answer it in again from my own perspective. I won't try and compete with your audience member by saying that if there was, well, again, I'm a language teacher. I was teaching when I was fired. I was teaching in French. I was a French immersion teacher, but I was teaching history and other subjects in French. So I do believe in grammar and logic. You can't go through a language like English without having logic and teaching it and so forth. And I certainly, apply those things to other parts of it. But the part of that question that I just would like to respond to, because it's just such a big question, is the critical thinking. Because in all curricula in Canada, including the BC curriculum, which was recently revamped, they make a big deal about critical thinking and reflection. And there's none of it. So to answer that question, I would say no. I think grammar is something. I have kids coming into grade 12 who don't know basic parts of speech, basic parts of the sentence, what different punctuation marks are called. So the grammar, the logic we can talk about generally, but what I really want to focus on here is the critical thinking. That you can't have critical thinking unless students are tested, and they test each other. And when you talk to young people in schools today, and I asked to say, what do you think about drag queens coming and presenting at your school? Because that happened in Surrey schools. So I know kids in these schools. I go around to all the schools in Surrey as a basketball referee. So I asked them, and they say, oh, we don't ask questions about anything. Because if we say something wrong, we're going to get in trouble, and I don't want to get a low mark, or I like my teacher when I make him or her mad. So it's just, the point is, it's not just an absence of critical thinking and reflection. There's an absence of open discussion because they're so worried about offending. So if there's any theory in school right now, it's the theory of safetyism, which means that you can't say anything that's going to violate people's emotional safety. And they'll also quote physical safety, words are violence, and all that kind of stuff. But of course, we know that's nonsense. But anything that upsets anybody is taken very seriously. And so teachers and students protect themselves by just censoring themselves. Self-censorship is the name of the game.
One other thing I wanted to talk to you about, I sent this in the email to you before the show. We talked to a whistleblower, well, not whistleblower, a daycare employee off the record told us that they're doing really weird and immoral stuff. So if a kid wants to play with a car, they'll say to that kid, no, 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 you have to play with these African drum sets instead. The kid happens to be black. Um, did you see anything like that in school?
Yes. They really are teaching to children on the basis of their outward characteristics. I think a lot of teachers sit very at the front of the class or stand very much in fear of, particularly if it's a majority white class, very much in fear of kids who are from one minority group or another, because they know that if they don't say the right thing or whatever, then that could really hurt them. Where if a teacher gets a white student complaining against him or her, a white teacher does, then it's not a big of a problem. So absolutely what they're doing with math, and I talked to many teachers at the school where it was last teaching, not because I approached them. I had no idea that wokeism was seeping its insidious way into math class. But what they're doing is they're saying they're changing, getting rid of all the textbooks, not because there's anything wrong with the math that's being taught, but the examples are Eurocentric. So you can't say if you got two trains in the night passing each other, one's going 50 kilometers an hour and the other's going 100 kilometers, blah, blah, blah. It has to be, okay, there's two canoes. And so we go back, and in doing so, what we do is we freeze Indigenous people as museum pieces, because teachers don't know a darn thing about present day life and in a reserve, which is, by the way, no different than life anywhere else. And majorities, 2/3 of Indigenous people don't live on reserves. So when they go back and live in reserves, they go back to their family. I'm sure there's not much of a difference. There's TVs and computers, and people buy food at the grocery store. And anyhow, they dress the same. Anyhow, it's just, so what they do to talk about Indigenous culture, they go back in time. And that's what the government does as well. So all the examples in the new curricula is all about, how Indigenous people lived. And you go, well, hold on a second. And how is that relevant to how they live today? Okay, sure. 100 years ago, it's fantastic that they lived in an igloo, or they lived in a wigwam or a teepee and so forth. But they don't anymore, and haven't for a long time. So why are we teaching them how to build these things? And kids do their little dioramas in class. I did it for a number of years because I just wanted to fit in. So you make a native village. And so everything we do with Indigenous people is 100, 200 years ago or more. And I think that's an interesting thing, is though we're assuming that they haven't evolved. So when I was in the school that I was fired from, I remember one pro day in particular, that one of the options, no, it wasn't an option, everyone had to do it, is we had to learn how a fish hook was made out of bone, out of animal bone. And I think, well, there's something that's uninteresting about that for me as a history teacher, because people did use bones to make tools. But why? Why? Because it's been a long time since Indigenous people have adopted the metal products of modern European or world society. There's much a part of modernity. I drive through reserves all the time. There's a number of reserves near where I live. I can drive through a reserve and I don't know where it begins and ends. It just looks like any other place. There's, the same homes, the same townhouses or whatever. Like, it's just, how do I know? Like, they're living as we live. They're not a distinct race, and yet we're presenting them as such. And then some people are talking about land back and decolonialism, which I mentioned that intentionally, and tying in with deconstructionism. And your excellent question is how do we get to where we are? Oh my God, why do we want to everything, like essentially destroy Western civilization and modernity? And I guess we get rid of modern science, and everybody goes and, every time they get a cut or whatever, they just sort of, put moss on it. Like, it's just absolute absurdity. Indigenous people want the same for themselves and their children as anybody else. And we're not talking about today, because if we're talking about them today, then they're no different than talking about ourselves. So we can't have that. And then people go, well, if we're going to talk about them in the past, let's really glorify it. And if it's so wonderful in the past, they didn't have wars, and they lived, water, they could drink wherever they were, and the air was pure and so forth. Then now people are going, well, let's go back in time. Let's get rid of colonialism. And you go, are these people absolutely insane? Because, not only can you not go back in time, any of us, but it's just such deceit to present to children that the answer to today's sophisticated problems, complex problems on and off reserves for Indigenous people, like fetal alcohol syndrome, which is the number one problem. What does it do for them if we don't address the real problems? Or, sorry, some people say, water, potable water is the number one problem. Whatever the number one problem is, we know the drug and alcohol addiction is very serious. We know that they don't always have good water, that they don't always have good all sorts of things, housing and so forth is adequate. That's what we should be addressing, and not trying demonizing my ancestors.
I'm going to ask a really basic question. What is the nature of the relationship of the federal government and these reserves? And I don't mean contractually or legally. If my septic tank doesn't work, or if my plumbing doesn't work, that's not Justin Trudeau's fault. So are these guys basically just a colony of the federal government? Because it doesn't seem like they're treating them like adults.
Well, you're, of course, continuing to ask very...
Sorry, just to clarify, when I say not adults, they're not treating them like free sovereign individuals. They're treating them like subjects.
Well, yes, because they're supposed to. That's what the Indian Act of 1876 did. It refers to them on the first page as wards of the state. And a ward is a dependent, is like a child, that they are to be dependent on the federal government. So when they get money for schooling, they don't get it from the provincial government. If they're on a reserve, they get it all from the federal government. So they're from cradle to death, they are to grave. They are taken care of by the federal government. And, I've obviously seen the numbers, and the numbers, are astronomical. It works out to between $40,000 and $45,000 per Indigenous individual every year that the Canadian government gives. And they don't just have two federal departments, because they have all sorts of programs in other departments as well. And so that's a huge amount of money that's given, and then the provinces and municipalities, and there's just all sorts of money going to Indigenous people. And so whether that's right or wrong is sort of less of interest to me right now than the fact that how are we going to break that dependency? That if I had a child living at home for too long, I would start having a discussion with that child and saying, well, at one point, you got to let your mom and dad figure out how we're going to manage for ourselves for the rest of time. And you've got to figure out how to be on your own and raise your kids. But we don't have these discussions in Canada. If Indigenous people are doing so badly, and that's not even true, of course, because you have some fabulously wealthy Indigenous communities in Canada, in Hobbema and Alberta, sitting on oil reserves, and obviously you have the Musqueam in downtown Vancouver, who are just wealthy as can be. Tsawwassen, very, very wealthy people now, and that's only in recent times when they realized that if the money in real estate, if they just brought in companies and tenants and so forth, they could make a lot of money. So, but what I don't understand is there's so many things I don't understand. But if people object to the fact that Indigenous people are not really given a full voice, are not given the respect that they merit, I would first agree with them, and then I'd ask, well, if that's the case, then why do we have laws in Canada that treat them different from other Canadians? Is that ultimately in their interests? And I would argue no. I think kids sitting at home knowing that money's going to come in anyway don't have the incentive to go to school. And residential schools, again, I know I'm doing this often, but segueing back to me and being a school teacher, knowing about schools and historically. But if you have, one of the reasons they had residential schools was because if the kids just go to day schools, then they stop going to school because they've got all the distractions in the reserve and they can just play games with their friends or go hunting or whatever. They can do all sorts of things. But if you take them and put them in a boarding school, in a residential school, then it's much easier to control them and make sure that they're being educated and living productively and playing sports and learning how to play a musical instrument and how to sew and all these things. I went to boarding school myself, not for long, but I did that. And I did it because I said to my parents, my father went to boarding school and his father went to boarding school and sent away to live. And I thought I needed it. I thought that I wasn't, I wasn't developing I was just a lazy guy that spent too much time playing ball hockey with friends. No, that wasn't lazy, but just too much time hanging out with friends and watching TV and not getting to my homework and not developing myself. And I felt that one day I'd be out competed. So I said, put me in, please, Dad, would you put me in boarding school? And, but that was the reason. It wasn't because I wanted to be, ripped from the arms of my mother by the people in the headmaster of the boarding school. No, you can look at it that way because they're happy to have another student, just like residential schools are happy to have students because they got paid per student. But I was sent there by my parents and of my own volition to get a better education and work harder. I just think when you treat a group of people in such a way as though that they know that they're always going to be given everything that they need, whether they work for it or not, is ultimately destructive.
I guess one last question I have, moving on to residential schools. Maybe we should nip this in the bud if people start criticizing us. What was there anything bad that happened with residential schools? I don't mean like an outlier. I mean, was this a process where they're going around yanking children away from the parents? Was there any bad aspects to it?
Well, there are all sorts of bad aspects to it. I think, again, we talked about postmodernism, deconstructionism, and decolonialism. I'm of that spirit where we can always do better. You go back and look at any school 100 years ago. I had a grandmother who was a great influence to me, and she was telling me that she was, her parents felt that the best education for her would be in a nunnery, and so she went far from her home, from Kingston, Ontario, to down to St. Catharines, and she was taught by nuns, and she was left-handed at the time, and if she used her left hand, she would be hit. If she didn't curtsy when a nun passed her in the hallway, she was hit. I think I wouldn't know where to begin. I think even in the classroom, they used to put dunce caps on kids' heads. And I'm not saying in residential schools, maybe they did that too. I just know they did that in schools 100 years ago. And so it was rough and wrong. And I still think we're doing wrong things in schools. What the heck are we bringing in drag queens to teach, kids in elementary school about anything to do with, they don't have a place there if they're being sexual in front of children. So I don't think our schools are perfect now. I think the woke people who are going about how bad schools are in the past the first thing I want to do is say to them is, well, look what you're doing to schools today. So yeah, of course, there's all sorts of things that were bad, but I think for the most part, considering the times, the context, the intentions, they were a good thing. They were a good thing because a lot of kids in the north and the west of Canada didn't have an alternative. It was a lot cheaper for governments to put these kids in day schools on reserves. but they didn't have once when the numbers were sufficient, but they couldn't do that otherwise. So for people to have the idea that that these schools had bad intentions, I would go, well, what was the alternative? Because there was only one alternative to residential schools, particularly for orphan kids or kids who didn't have enough food, the other necessities of life. What was the alternative? Death, in some cases, no education in every case. So I don't know. And who else was going to work? Who else was going to go out other than religious people? Who was going to give of themselves for low pay to try and do something that was godly in the sense of doing it for altruistic reason?
We have a funny comment from one of the audience. One more godless woman says, "I'm 60 and my left hand was smacked with a ruler by a nun. Now I'm ambidextrous."
Well, but I find that interesting because, and I want to thank the person for that. But I can only speak from my own experiences. I'm sharing a room right now with my wife, whose grandmother was an orphan, and she was raised by nuns. So she was raised; she didn't die. But they didn't judge her smart enough to have an education. So she never learned to read or write. She worked in a laundromat until she was 16. And then she went out and didn't know what to do and married an older man. And that was her life. And she signed her name in later life with an X, and so life was rough for all sorts of people. And so the person is just saying that, my grandmother became not ambidextrous. I mean, maybe she was ambidextrous, but she wrote with her right hand. She never had great handwriting, which is interesting when I think about it. But she was punished. She would have been punished, she was punished for left hand. So I'm not here to say that everything that people did back in time, teachers, religious people, whatever, was right. Of course, there's much we can be critical, including with our own parents. And then we try and be better parents ourselves. And then our children look at us and trying to be better than we are or were. So yeah, I had this discussion, Payman, with just talking about residential schools with a friend yesterday from Italy. He said he had a grandmother who, as a young girl during the Second World War, watched 93 members of her extended family being lined up against a wall and shot with machine guns by Nazi soldiers. She watched 93 people being murdered in her extended family. You can imagine what Jewish people witnessed during the Second World War, and Italians and all sorts of people. And so this idea of living in the past and creating people into victims and not addressing their current needs is, I think, criminal. I think people like Trudeau are going to be looked upon by later historians as being very destructive to the very people that they pretended that they represented.
Yeah, no, you'll get no argument from me. But the question I was asking, the reason I was asking it, I believe that people are confounding two different things. Basically, I think these residential schools are a lightning rod for the fact that we have compulsory education. So if you have compulsory education laws and you don't put your kid in school, the consequence is that people are going to come and rip your children out of your arms and put them in school. Do you see where I'm going with this? Like, it's not necessarily the residential school. Isn't it the Egerton Ryerson legacy of compulsory education?
Yes. I would love you to attack me. I'd love you because you're so smart. I'd love you to tell me, Jim, you're wrong about this or that. The problem right now, Payman, is we're agreeing with each other on every account. And here's another one. Education for all kids became compulsory fully 49 years before it became compulsory in 1920 for Indigenous children.
Oh, okay.
So in other words, my ancestors as children in Canada were ripped out of their mother's arms. Not that many 7-year-olds or whatever, 14-year-olds are ripped out of parents' arms anyhow. But the 49 years before Indigenous children were. So you could also say we were wrong because we didn't have residential schools sooner. We were wrong because we didn't have compulsory education and European, ethnocentrism and colonialist thought sooner, because Indigenous children deserved a right, have the same right to an education as any other Canadian. That was always the law. The law in Canada and its foundation never talked about this group having fewer rights than others. Education is one of the most important rights of all. So anybody that says, again, I asked the question and you didn't respond to it, and because it's more a rhetorical question, but if someone says residential schools were horrible, or they more reasonably say they were bad in this way or that way, and I would say, yes, okay, fine, I agree with you. And we've worked to improve them, and we worked over time to have, with vaccinations, to have fewer kids, obviously susceptible to diseases and stuff. So I get all that. And those are valid points. But 150 years ago, if you were in the Arctic or you were in the middle of a forest and, around Yellowknife, what would you do as an alternative to residential schools if you were going to give these kids an education? Because there was no alternative. But government schools staffed not only by nuns and priests, a lot of the staff in all residential schools was Native. There weren't people around to cook and to supervise in dormitories and serve as janitors and cut wood for the stoves. This is work done by Indigenous people in these schools. So the idea that kids in these schools were incinerated and hung and drowned and all the other things you hear and impregnated, well, that's kind of interesting, because that would have had to have taken place in front of a lot of Indigenous staff at each one of those schools.
No, I get where you're going with it, but we're kind of in a post-truth world, where post-reason world. It's very difficult to reason with people. They all think and act emotionally, on emotion.
Well, yeah, and I said that too. So again, in saying that, I had a lot of people respond to a post from yesterday, and many positively. I had close to 6,000 likes, but I had some really awful things said, what people would like to do to me. And some of them I wrote back. I didn't have time to write back. I try to write back to everyone who writes to me, or post something that is, anyhow, that needs to be addressed. And I did it in a polite way. I just said, well, why don't you argue with me? Why don't you tell me where I am wrong factually? And take that approach. And it's funny because so often it works with people, and they, well, provide me with statistics or whatever. And then I say, okay, I will do that. But I never, as a teacher, stood in front of my students and said, by the way, everything out of my mouth is gospel truth. I just said, I'm an informed individual who spent a long time listening to adults, myself in school, and I'm older now, and I think of something to say of value to you guys, meaning my students. But I don't pretend to always be right. And if you find me wrong, or if you disagree with me, you might change the way I think. But we don't do that in Canada. It's not only post-truth, which I agree with you on. It's post conversation. It's post-dialogical process of you say one thing, I disagree, and then we try and create that wonderful this synthesis, this wonderful consensus that we can move forward and get along with. We do that in a marriage. We do that with our own children. Look, you're going to pick up your clothes, and then mom's going to have dinner ready at 6, and I'll drive you to soccer practice. But it's just this constant negotiation to try and make things work for everybody. But we're not allowed to converse anymore, because the moment someone like me or you says something that's unpopular, then we become threatened with job loss or reputational damage. And so, yeah, when I was even accused of wanting my wife dead, if you can believe that.
Jeez.
There was because during the people became so angry with me because I was not woke. So I questioned things. So the residential school thing, and afterwards I questioned a lot of the things they were doing based on race and gender and all these other issues. And so they became very angry with them. And then they said, this one kid said one day, and this was 6 months after I last was in the classroom, that I told my kids that my wife had cancer and she had to go for a life-saving and risky operation in hospital. So I had to leave the school, and I did. I had to leave to be with my wife for a month. The allegation was that I said to students, while I'm telling them that I had to leave them and not finish the term with them, that I said that I wanted a better wife, so it wasn't a problem. So the allegation was I insulted anyone with cancer and insulted my wife, and of course there's no evidence of that, and the child who made the allegation, if she indeed even made it, if it wasn't completely made up by my employer, was a girl who with learning disability and anyhow, but nobody talked to me. Nobody ever said, before saying something as horrible as that I wanted my wife dead so I could have a better wife. Nobody said to me, well, Jim, I would like to hear your side of the story. And I said, well, I didn't say that. I would never have said that. In fact, I was very emotional when I was telling my students I had to leave them. And so it just changes everything. When I wouldn't be spending the last few years tweeting every day and doing all sorts of things. If somebody had just taken me aside and said, Jim, in class, you said disease and not murder. You suggested these kids weren't murdered. And it is our belief that the kids were murdered, because that was the allegation against me. I didn't say murder. That's, again, wrote that. I did not say murder. I would have said to them, well, it wasn't murder. There's no evidence of ever there being murder. It wasn't in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. There's never been a case in the history of Canada of a teacher murdering his or her students, and certainly in a residential school, because where was a lot of attention. There were regular inspections. There were doctors and nurses visiting all the time. There were all sorts of people going in and out, providing services, plumbers, electricians. There were all sorts of people going in and out of schools, and parents were going in and out of schools because they were always welcome. And so this idea that there was murder, no, there wasn't. I think my principal would have thought, oh, Jim's making a lot of sense. We'll just ignore that comment by that kid about, who got mad that Jim didn't say murder. And then maybe I'll go home and maybe do a bit of research. Like, it just would have ended, because the principal would have gone, oh, okay. And the Kamloops band, as you know, 3 years after, they're saying, confirmed that all these dead bodies and a mass grave. 3 years later, last May, they said, well, all we found was anomalies. There's just a GPR, comprehensive radar study done by one person who said, these targets of interest, well, they're presenting, maybe child graves. Yeah, maybe rocks or soil or trunk or septic tiles or something else could be in the soil. Like, could be a billion things could be in the soil, animal bones or farm equipment, whatever, or nothing. And so even they say it's anomalies they found. So there's just, yeah, I think before we're going to have truth, we have to have the ability to once again talk without getting upset and punishing each other. You're not doing that because you're a smart, intelligent guy who knows that there's value in hearing from people with different opinions.
I think I was the same before I started running for office, and then now I have this podcast. But actually, even before, it was during COVID when I started going to protests, and I always like to show up 2 hours before the music started, and I just talk to people. Now, at a protest, you get an echo chamber, but this concept of talking to people and compromise is what you're describing. It's necessary, and it's something that we've lost, and I don't fully understand where and how and when we lost it, but we've definitely lost it.
Well, thank you for saying so. No, I'm conscious of the fact that people might be tired of listening to me, but what I would really love is if anybody in your audience or you yourself, Payman, would tell me where I'm wrong in anything I've said, because I would like to address that. I'm proud of myself and the reading that I've done, particularly in recent times, to make sure that I didn't say anything untoward in a classroom. And so if there's something that I've done wrong, I'd like to know it. And otherwise, then there should be more people out there being upset that that in Canada in 2000, well, now it's 2024, teacher can be treated as I was treated, by everybody. Nobody came to my defense, and I know that my union has to operate in faithful representation. But I really feel that the whole school system, if not the whole society, is run by people who are authoritarian and who are being captured or not captured and just pretend to go along by a reification of communism, by a really ugly idea that the way to a better world is to have an enemy. It's like in Russia during the revolution. They took the wealthy farmers, the kulaks, and said, get rid of them and our problems are solved. But it didn't make the poor farmers any more productive. It just brought war and death. And so I just don't understand the cancel culture, that wanting to run after people like me and hurt me for saying something that anybody who does any reading knows is correct.
We got some words of encouragement from Canuck Saram. You're not wrong. Nobody that is objectively reasonable and rational can conclude that of you and the unfair treatment that you have been abused with. So people see it. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate and thank you very much, that person who wrote that. And but I'm fine. I'm not here to complain about myself. I'm old enough to deal with adversity. And then maybe in a way I'm showing my students that, I was living what I was preaching. And, but I think we need to not be so hard with dissident voices. And Orwell had that line. He said, the future is going to be, what is it? Steel boot crushing the human face forever. And there is a little bit of that in recent times, this wanting to vilify. And when people went to Ottawa to protest the restrictions on truckers going across the American border, for them to be greeted as misogynists and racists and revolutionaries, and I just thought, wow, maybe they've got a legitimate grievance and they need to be listened to. So we need to I think as we move forward as a society, we need to stop the condemnation of anybody who thinks differently from us, because lately the people who are in authority in Canada have got absolutely everything wrong in the school system. Oh my gosh, what an absolute embarrassment. One of the things that they've done now for maybe 15 years, you can't give zeros, you can't give late marks, you can't you can't get mad at a kid. You can't fail. You can't you can't do anything to let the kid make a kid accountable. So, and I was always kind of that way. It doesn't really help to fail kids. So I was kind of finding other ways to lift kids up. But there was this one kid that I taught about 4 years ago who would lie in desks and threaten kids and hit kids and swear at me and keyed my car twice, which cost me a lot of money. He was just the most difficult kid in the world. Didn't do a stick of work and missed a lot of classes. And I just couldn't imagine a worse student. And I said, I really need to fail this kid. And I failed the kid. It was a grade 9 boy. And I gave him a failing mark. And and what they do in schools is they change the marks of teachers. And so the kid went from grade 9 to grade 10 social studies because they don't want any kid failing. And I'm thinking sometimes, whoa, okay, I understand you don't want kids to fail, but they have to suffer consequence. There has to be something. I didn't mind if you move the kid forward, but you move the kid forward with an F mark, knowing that the kid didn't pass grade 9, but you want to keep the kid in grade 10, fine. Keep the kid with his or her peers. You can do lots of things to help support kids, give kids second chances. I believe in it. But there have to be consequences. It's just absolutely awful for our society, for children. I just can't imagine raising children myself without consequences. So one day people are going to look back at schooling in the late 1980s and 90s and certainly in the last 25 years and go, what the heck happened? Because it doesn't help children not to be challenged, not to be tested, not to be punished. If you don't do any work, what right does that child have compared to other children to get the same mark and the same opportunities the next year? But that's what they're doing.
No, it's clown world. I always say kids need discipline. Like otherwise, you get what was that? Lord of the Flies.
Well, but it is because then you don't have any standards. And we talk about, a lot of teachers talk about feeling afraid in schools. They're not just afraid of the snitches and the unorthodoxy sniffers which exist and they can ruin their career as they ruin mine. But they're worried about physically because the teacher can't do anything. And situations built in classrooms, there could be a fight between two big boys or whatever. And you get caught in situations and you just go by. It wasn't like that when you were younger. The moment there was a violent kid in a school, that was dealt with. And now what they do is so often they don't deal with it because they don't want to upset parents, or they simply move this kid to another school and they do a deal. Well, I'll take that kid if you take my violent kid. And then everybody pretends that. So I really think there's been a terrible paucity of good leadership in schools and more broadly.
All right, Jim. I guess to wrap up the episode, we can kind of see your handle, but where can people follow you, or can they donate to you anyways?
Thank you. I would love people to follow me on Twitter and just get a different perspective on a lot of these things. And of course, I post a lot of stuff that's not from me, but from other people that I think have something like you and payment and something of value. So I'd be honored to have more people following me. But that's all I ask for people is, and I love listening to what people contribute to my home feed and contribute themselves and their own platforms. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Payman.
No, thank you for coming on, and I'm sure you're going to get a couple more followers today, and we'll stay in touch. Jim, I'm just going to hold you over until after the stream, but otherwise, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.